Alright, so in this video, we're going to tackle where we are right now, where the quarantines and lockdowns are ending and being lifted, and where we're headed and what the risks are going forward. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of background, a little history to it. We're going to show you how the disruptions in food could easily happen, would happen, why they would happen, and when they will happen. So stick with the video and you'll be rewarded. In this video, I'm not talking about the temporary food shortages that you see from time to time because of panicked buyers, and they rush down to the store and fill their cart with toilet paper, and whatever, and so you temporarily have shelves that are bare. That's not what I'm talking about.
It really is unexplainable.
The sudden push for preparedness has stores rushing to replenish. President Trump urging moderation from consumers.
You don't have to buy so much. Take it easy. Just relax.
I'm talking about the kinds of food shortages that morph into famines, something that the West hasn't seen in a long time, and especially North America. All right, welcome to our channel where we talk about financial independence, retiring early, and all aspects of that idea, whether it's at home or abroad. First, I wanted to start with food shortages do turn into famines. There are so many instances of famines throughout the world, throughout history. So that's one way that we can know what the future holds, is by looking at the past. So when I did a study on this, I found the amount of famines worldwide that just kept coming back just every 10, 15, 20 years in a lot of places in the world was just astounding to me. Before I tell you about these famines, just to give you paint a picture here, to give it a historical context, there's not like a whole bunch of different reasons why these famines happened. I mean, there are a variety of reasons, but they tend to cluster around 2 or 3 main reasons, which you'll find out. So way back, there was a huge worldwide famine, which was called the extreme weather event in the 5th, 6th century. That was due to volcanic eruption. And I imagine that back then the world as we know it was really kind of clustered, around a certain geographical area. And so, if there was a huge volcanic eruption, clearly it would seem like the whole world went dark. But nowadays, people are spread out over, 7 or 8 billion, whatever it is. But anyway, in 1200, there was a volcanic eruption in Japan that caused a famine where 2 million people, now listen to these numbers, 2 million people died of hunger and starvation due to a volcanic eruption in Japan. And then in the 1300s, in the Middle Ages, Europe seemed to have a lot of recurring famines, especially during those Middle Ages. Listen to these numbers. 7.5 million people died of hunger and starvation in Europe in the Middle Ages. In the 1600s, Russia had extreme weather and then also a volcano. Now this is the domino effect I talked about in a different video, so that if you, for example, if you have, say, an extreme winter and you had a bad harvest, right? That's the beginning of a food shortage, right? And a famine. But then as spring rolls around, if a volcano erupts and it clouds your whole spring and summer, there goes your next harvest. So that's that domino effect. So 2 million people died in Russia in 1600. In the 1690s in France, 1.3 million. In the 1770s in India, 10 million. These numbers are just unfathomable. In China in 1810 and 11 and then in the 1840s, 40 million people died of starvation. This is unfathomable. It doesn't end in China. In 1907, 60 years later, 25 more million people died. And then in 1828, 20 years later to 1928 to 1930, 10 million more people. And then in the 40s, again, 3 million people. So decamillions of people have died in the last century in China of starvation, just in China alone. And then after, this latest communist takeover in 59-61, up to 45 million people just in that 2-year famine died in China. Cambodia had a similar Khmer Rouge communist takeover in the 70s where 2 million people died. So these numbers I wanted to put in perspective because we see these, these headlines about how 250,000 people have died worldwide of this virus, okay? And not even putting that into perspective by comparing it to other flu pandemics. Just looking at starvation, because the discussion here is about starvation, because the end result of the panic over the virus is what? Lockdowns, right? Lockdowns, and then what comes after the lockdowns, right? Quarantines and lockdowns. So fortunately, these lockdowns seem to be lifting. However, there's a specter looming on the horizon here globally, because we have seen that this lockdown due to the virus pandemic was and is pretty global. One thing leads to another. The thing is that if these lockdowns are permitted to continue, or if this reaction to virus pandemics or influenza or any kind of sickness pandemics, if the reaction is allowed to go there again with these kinds of lockdowns, there's no telling what can happen. And I just gave you all of those figures to paint a picture so that you'll know that, look, really serious famines are always a possibility, okay? So this isn't pie in the sky stuff. And yes, there's a variety of different reasons why they happen, but as we shall see, there's a recurring theme. For example, okay, I'm just gonna do a couple of examples. One of them you probably have heard of, and it was the Irish potato famine. They referred to it as the potato famine. So the great famine and hunger of Ireland in the mid-1800s. Now, what was happening there that's important to know is that Ireland was colonized by England, and so the English overlords were dictating to the Irish farmers what they should eat and plant. Kind of like saying, hey, you guys, you need to be eating potatoes. They're easier to grow. You just put them in the ground and wait, and they're cheaper because of that. They're cheap. So you guys, the workers, have to eat potatoes. So the good workers and the good citizens, they listened to and they abided by what they were being told. But what happened is, if you guys are gardeners, you know that if you plant the same thing over and over and over, infestation occurs for a variety of reasons I won't go into in this video. That's a different conversation. But over a period of time, because they were having failures in their crops prior to this huge famine, and eventually culminated into this really huge failure, and the government did absolutely nothing other than dictating to the Irish what they should eat, and then they did it, and then these famines came around. They didn't even help the Irish as they were starving, blaming it on some kind of philosophy, a philosophical view, blaming it on laissez-faire, saying, totally distorting the meaning of laissez-faire, which means leave financial activity alone, not leave people that are starving alone. It was a total twist, an excuse for the government not to help. There was some people in government that went to the States for help and got some corn shipped over, but long story short, they weren't really ready to process corn, and a lot of people died of starvation. Now keep in mind what we just said about what the real cause of that, because a lot of the historical commentary is that, bad potato crops. But the real issue here, as we shall see, is a recurring theme that comes in these 3 examples that I'm doing, and that's the first one. The second one is, so the other famine was in Russia. They had several of them, but one of the biggest ones that killed millions of people was right after the communist revolution And a lot of these famines happen because there is disruption due to wars. Now that's understandable. You've got wars and people are too busy killing each other to run farms and produce food. You know, the communist governments that through mismanagement and error and ignorance, they actually caused these famines. And one of the things I've studied was the Russian communism, you know, after the Bolshevik Revolution. What they would do is the communists would take over the farms. You know, the communists are just all about collective. And so they would take over the farms and then they would dictate, this is for top down, you know, dictate to the farmers what to grow. And in a particular case, they were telling these farmers they had to grow corn. This was in the winter in Russia. They were telling the farmers they were that ignorant that they had to grow corn. Now, none of the farmers would argue because if you did that, that you would get killed. And so you don't argue with the Tsar. If he says grow corn, you say, oh, okay, or they'll just kill you on the spot. So then after a few months, when they went back to get the corn and there wasn't any, then of course they just got killed then. So they only bought themselves a few months. This is historical fact. I've done a study on this. I'm not just, you know, making this up. That was obviously a political problem with the kind of government that they had, which was the communism. But even during situations that were similar, like in Ireland and then in Cambodia, and there's a few others that come to mind. So those are some of the most just deadly famines throughout history and even recent history. And those are some of the reasons. So you might say, no, Frank, that was back then, back in the day. Nowadays, we've got all these new farming techniques. We've got mechanized farming. We've got huge corporate farms with big, huge industrious machinery. And that's just not going to happen, right? And normally you'd be right, except for we don't live in normal times. As you know, there are people out there that want to make your life more difficult. So it doesn't take rocket science to determine, based on the facts we've just analyzed, that in many of the cases of historical importance of these famines that happened historically, in many, you know, if you take aside the ones that happened because of bad weather, the ones that happened for maybe there were wars going on, government policy directly affected and spearheaded these famines. In other words, people at the top dictating to people at the bottom what they should do and how they should do it. That is the direct result. You can, you know, go through the figures yourself. This isn't my opinion. Those are the facts. It's historical. It's right there. You know, you're talking about going forward. There's going to be pandemics. There's going to be sickness. And, you know, is this how you want to handle it? I mean, is this how people want to handle it? You know, people need to get with it and get the facts and understand historical facts. Get the knowledge base, understand. I'm saying all this to tie it all together with these recent events of the lockdowns, the worldwide lockdowns. We had a close call, an imminent food shortage issue with the thing about in the United States is you've got these huge corporate conglomerates that have bought up these huge industries and they have ownership, like monopolistic ownership. You know, you've probably heard of some of these meat processing plants. They're not just meat processors. I mean, they act as a go-between between the farm and the table. I mean, between the guys producing on the farm and you going to the store and putting it on the table nicely, it's nicely already cut and packaged and ready to just put in the pan. You know, these companies do this for you, and they own, you know, certain companies own all of them. And so when the lockdown came down, yes, these places are, as I've mentioned in other videos, extremely unhygienic and unsanitary because of just the situation with the animals and the antibiotics and the, you know, and just the filth. Okay, so yes, people are going to get sick.
Processing plants with coronavirus outbreaks are closing, creating a bottleneck in the supply chain. President Trump's order Tuesday, requiring processing plants to remain open, comes with trade-offs. The meat supply versus the health of the workers inside the plants.
Is the risk of not having enough food or having some people being exposed to the COVID-19, and I don't think that there's any solution that is going to cover both sides.
But as you know, your president ordered them to stay open. So
a warning tonight about the country's food supply chain. Meat and poultry could be hard to find at the stores. More than a dozen meat processing plants are closed around the country right now because of coronavirus outbreaks. President Trump signed an executive order today compelling those plants to stay open.
A food shortage was averted, but I'm saying that on a global scale, we've got things going on that if these kinds of lockdowns are looked at as a solution going forward, these close calls may not get averted. You've already got situations out in Asia. You've got huge clouds of locusts the clouds are as big as a city that are just devouring farm food. Africa's having issues. If the U.S. goes down, a lot of other countries can go down, because if you listen to the United Nations, they'll tell you that the starvation's in Africa, but the coming starvation can easily morph into a global problem, with the U.S. being one of the first dominoes, other than what's happening with the locusts. Because the domino effect says that you could start with the lockdown. Imagine the lockdown, right, all summer long, let's say, just as a for instance. And then in the summer, something else happens that causes that to be prolonged, whether it's extreme weather, volcanoes, wars, any of the usual things that cause the famines.
This email we got was from the United States Department of Agriculture, and they were plowing up crops across the nation, dumping milk, chickens, and hogs. And I believed this email was to prepare us for that possibility with cattle.
Why is it such a big deal where people are given a pushback of where the meat is coming from?
As a consumer, you don't know what you're buying. It oppresses our prices because there's no competition for it.
Why should the consumer care?
We are importing beef, and we are destroying our harvests at a time when people don't have jobs.
Is it similar to what Walmart did to a lot of mom and pop shops and put them out of business?
It's the same thing.
Who's the Amazon of your world?
I'm not sure there is an Amazon of our world.
Maybe there's an idea right there.
We don't want the government getting in on our beef industry. Sonny Perdue, he's a globalist. 2 of our 4 main beef packers are Brazilian owned, and they've been caught in these fraudulent cases in their own countries. What do you think they're doing in the United States?
Tyson Food, Cargill, JBS, National Beef, those are the 4 you're talking about.
There will be a takeover of our industry, and then a lot of these producers will become serfs to the oligarchy, and I think that's where we're headed.
Don't underestimate disruption to food distribution businesses that have a monopoly on this thing. Anyway, thanks for watching the video. Thanks for coming to our channel. And as always, have a nice day.